Hello, my name's Kevin Bolwell and I'm a retired farmer and been in the CFA as a volunteer for over 40 years. I'd like to talk to you about header fires, harvest fires that is becoming more prolific over the last few years. I'm going to talk about three different facets. I'm going to talk to you about what I believe is what's causing these fires, talk about how we can go about minimising the fires, and the last section I'll talk about is what sort of plan you can have to help you get through the harvest with managing fires. So the first thing is about the cause of fires. The causes of fires during harvest, and we've taken our research from Europe, America, we've taken it from people in Australia, insurance companies, the Cadena Group in Western Australia, the Grains Research Development and various other people's, plus our own CFA records, and we come up with a conclusion about where fires start and what happens. So that approximately 20% of the fires start in a mechanical sense on your header, which is bearings, any moving mechanical parts. Electrical fires start from electrical components of the header, and there's also fires start from hydraulics and air conditioner clutches and a few things like that. About 20% of fires start from those sources. The other 80% of fires start from the engine bay, which is a broad statement that we needed to look into and find out how, why and where. So what we did with the engine bay fires is that we went and sat down and just looked at the header. So for a fire to start, you need to have an ignition source, you need to have fuel, and you need to have oxygen. So it was pretty obvious sitting there looking at the engine where the oxygen was coming from. We measured speeds of between 70 and 100 kilometres an hour coming out of the fan around the engine. So naturally enough, we had our oxygen. Then we were looking for an ignition source. So we had to have a consistent ignition source that we could actually point to. And after testing around the engine while it was running under full power, harvesting, we were able to zero it down to a small area on the manifold. Between the actual manifold and the turbo is the hottest part of the engine achieving. So that was, as far as we were concerned, was the ignition point. And the fuel was the problem that we had to analyse and talk about and think about and see what was going on. In the conclusion, we wrote on the back of the header at night, during the daytime, you could smell burning but you couldn't see it. But it turned out to be what we were smelling was dust coming past the ignition point, driven by the fan, was igniting. It'd ignite in spurts or it'd ignite and burn continuously, depending on the fuel air ratio. So that was our ignition point, the combination of the fuel coming past, the dust fuel coming past the manifold. But that wasn't lighting the fires. What we found then was that odd particles of husks and flag and things would come through the system. They'd get in this lit area and then drop down and then feed down off the header. Different models of headers done things in different ways, but the end result was it was basically the same for all the engines. The reason that this is becoming more of a prolific source of fires is because the modern day engines, as we all know with every other engine that we've got in the modern terminology, the environmental factors of making the engines hotter and hotter and running hotter. You go back many years ago, the older engines were running at approximately 600 degrees or so exhaust gas temperature, where our modern diesels can run up to 1600 degrees exhaust gas temperature. So that was, as far as we were concerned, the engine bay fires. We've done a lot of exploration. We've sent information back to the States to a bloke that studied over 1,000 header fires. I spoke with the late Dr. Graham Quick, and then we spoke to our neighbours that I used to live next to before we sold out. Went and analysed headers and all that. That's the conclusion we come up with. A lot of people talk about other sources and various things, but that was the only concrete thing we could come up with. There is various theories on static electricity and things like that. With static electricity, what we did with static electricity was a bloke in the States put dust in a glass chamber and worked out the amount of kilojoules in a spark that was needed to ignite that dust. And when we come back and looked at headers in Australia, we never found, we could only find a quarter or a third of that amount of power. So we couldn't actually pinpoint static electricity. And so the other causes of the fires with the mechanical issues, we starting at the front of the header, with the new draper fronts, we found that the bearings on the end of the rubber mats were not actually getting hot, but they were falling apart and starting fires. As you come back through the front, there's drives on the front, in the throat of the draper front. There was chain tensions and various things that were causing fires there. When you come back through the header, you've got idlers that are on keeping belts tight all around the header, which run at a fairly high speed with a small bearing. We found that they were lighting fires. And then we found the catastrophes, like a gearbox blowing apart, a drive box on the back of the rotor blowing apart, bringing the header to a dead stop. All the belts and that are gone. But they were only 20% of the fires. So that was what the conclusions we come up with. Our next thought was to minimise this from happening. So with the dust fires, we started thinking about this ignition point. With the information we got back from the States, we discovered that different dusts off different plants ignite at different temperatures. Lentils was the worst, of course, but we found that, say for instance, in a barley crop that had leaf scald on it, it was very similar to lentils in the ignition point. Other times with barley, we found that it was a third more temperature on the ignition point before it would ignite. So it depends on the year, the crop, how it finishes, whether you spray the lentils with if you desiccate the lentils, that seems to affect lower the ignition point of the dust. So there's a lot of factors that'll come from year to year. Say once every 10 years, barley will give you trouble. At other years, lentils, chickpeas, won't even worry. You can just roar into them at full pace. But with the different varieties of lentils and other pulses, with the newer headers, with consistently giving high temperatures at the manifold, and with the newer fronts and the way the headers are designed and the varieties are making the lentils stand up a little bit more, we can actually fill the header right up and make it work very hard. The computer just keeps giving you more power and keeps the engine running and keeps it running hot. So we had to think of some way of minimising the fires, and the conclusion we come up with was that we had to get rid of one of the sources. The fuel being the dust, the ignition point being the manifold or the oxygen. Well, we had to keep the oxygen. The dust is very hard to handle. There's been a few theories about how to minimise the dust coming in. Some model headers have got the air intake into the radiators above the radiator intake, trying to suck cleaner air. Different types of centrifugal cleaners on the front of the radiator to try and minimise the dust. But it was a hard one to handle. What we did find was that if we were to slow the header down ground speed a little bit, we could keep the exhaust gas temperatures down lower, and that would lower the ignition point to a point where it wouldn't ignite the dust. And we're able to put two headers in a paddock. We're able to have one over here lighting fires and this one not. And we could swap them over. We could dictate to them just in the way they were driven. Driven hard and the box full in softer soils, black soils, sandy soils, things like that. Pushing the header very hard, you could actually make them ignite quite regularly. And then just by backing off a little percentage, it varied from header to header. From when you start harvesting on the run, you might have an empty box. You can push the header a little bit harder. When your box starts to fill, you've got to back off the ground speed a little bit just to slow the header down to lower that ignition point. Once you get used to the idea, it's the smell of the burning dust that you smell. You often smell it when you're going around the header. That is the smell you can smell. And once you get yourself sort of organised, you can actually sense when your header's running at a point where it's cool enough not to ignite the dust. It's something you've got to work. Every model's different. Different way they develop their horsepower, different torque points and all those sort of things. So we can't give you an exact figure, but we do know that if you slow your header down a little bit, you can virtually eliminate the fire starting around concerning with dust. Other things we found was that the pre-cleaner on the front of the radiator, if the seals on that or it wasn't spinning properly, the bearings are a bit tight and things like that, or the blanking off plate that cleans it every time it turns around, if that was jamming and coming around, there's all those sort of factors were contributing to clumping on the engine of bigger particle pieces, such as the husk and the flag. What we found was that if we spent a bit of time in adjusting those up, putting new seals around the spinning piece on the front of the radiator, we were able to eliminate a lot of those bigger particles getting in the engine. Another thing we found was even though the engines weren't overheating, the fan speed was slowing down. And what we found was that the multi-rib belts, the new multi-rib belts and the pulleys are all very fine. And if you look at the front of your engine, you can see a lot of sandblasting on the front of the engine, taking the edges off. And we quickly realised that the edges were going off the pulleys and the belts were slipping a little bit, not a lot. And because of the design of them, they don't squeal that much and they still keep driving a percentage, but not 100%. And when we put new pulleys and belts on, and these are headers I'm talking about doing 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 hours, depending on what they've been harvesting, it stopped all the congregating of dust and that around the manifolds in hidden spots away from where that are behind the wind, out of the wind blast. When we put new pulleys and belts on, it cleaned the engine down quite considerably. If you can't avoid the header being in the dust all the time, or when you're stripping down one way of the paddock it's clear and you turn around and come back the other way and you're getting dust all around your radiator intake, that's when you slow down a considerable amount, like say 10 or 15% off your ground speed. Then when you turn around and come into the wind, you can hook back into it again because you've got the fuel removed, so you don't have to worry too much about the ignition point. Unloading on the go was another thing that we found, that unloading into the chaser bin, the computer senses when you're unloading and increases the horsepower and therefore heating up the ignition point. As far as the minimising bearings and mechanical devices causing fires, we've used a thermal thermometer, which are about $50 from mechanical places like Repco's and Autobahn, and we were able to keep a check on the temperature of the bearings. Once you get the idea of what this temperature of this bearing should be running at and the temperature of this bearing is running at, you can actually pull the bearing out before it falls down. Some things you can't avoid, and we all know that. Catastrophic blow-ups of gearboxes and things like that are just basically unforeseen. But you can eliminate a lot of the mechanical bearing failures by keeping a very close watch on the temperatures. When we were young fellas, we had headers that you could feel the vibration. On some of the headers I've owned, I just used to kick my boot off and put my sock boot on the floor of the header, and I could sense the vibration of the header when it was working at its maximum and keep it on that maximum all day, and that's how I sensed it was happening. With a modern day header, you're isolated from that happening, so you're sealed up in your cabin, the engine hooks into it and you don't know just exactly how hard that engine's really working. So you need to be aware of how your engine's working. You need to sort of start sensing that and feeling that when you're driving the header, even though you're in those beautiful enclosed sound-sealed cabins. You need to get back in touch with your engine and just be the master of it instead of the computer being the master of it. So it's just something. We're not asking you to decrease your productivity in the paddock. We're just asking you to have to think about how your header's working in the paddock and how you can manage it to keep the exhaust gas temperature down a little bit, and that will eliminate 90 or 100%. It eliminates 100% of the fires as everything's going well for you. If you've got a few problems with air intake and things like that, you're still going to get it clumping around the header. Header hygiene is also important, as we all well know. You need to keep your engine clean, and you need to clean it often. Sometimes you may have to clean it numerous times during the day. But if you manage your intake of dust, and if you manage the ignition point, you can keep the header going without stopping it so often to clean it down. So they're the sort of factors that we've proven to ourselves. And if anybody else has got thoughts about how it should be done and all the rest of it, we're quite open to be, people can say to us, this is what we discovered, this is what we discovered. We've only just scratched over the surface a bit as best we can. And we do know that at different varieties, different soil types and different finishing conditions and different model headers make a lot of varying factors into the system. I also like to talk about how you manage your harvest in general. What I found was a lot of people were hooking into the paddock based on their computer auto steer and not really thinking about the fire problem, and then they're harvesting on the downwind side of the paddock, so that the upwind side of the paddock, and the fire does start, it goes into their into the crop that's not been harvested. So you sort of got to have a little bit of management strategies about how you're going to go into the paddock. On certain days you've got to look at altering your strategy around where the fire risk factor starts to build, say from 15 kilometres an hour to 25 kilometres an hour to 30 kilometres an hour, 35 kilometres an hour wind speeds. You need to be aware that your risk factor is getting greater and greater to burn more and more. So you need to have a little bit of a management strategy. You need to think about perhaps changing paddocks to another paddock that's not got obvious burn-on throughs to your neighbours and things like that, and various other things that you can sort of manage the strategies of lessening the risk of your burns. One of the things I found was that with modern day harvesting, you've got people going everywhere. You've got somebody on the header. In my case, I've had my 12-year-old daughter on the header, and I've had my 80-year-old father on the header. I've left them in the paddock on their own. I think it's something that we need to think about, is having a fire management plan around how you're going to operate your header and your harvest operation. You need to think about where you're going to unload and load. You need to think about tractors that are on field bins. If you're using Grandpa's tractor on your field bin, it's going to have, when it gets around a fair few thousand hours, it's going to have a little bit of carbon in the exhaust. This year we had a couple of 3 fires that were started by the carbon being shook out of the exhaust when it's unloading, driving the field bin auger and unloading. We had people pulling field bins across the paddock with modern day diesel utes which are running extremely hot exhaust. We've had trucks pulling in the paddock on modern diesel trucks, Scanias, Volvos, not blaming them, but that's some that come to mind, that have got extremely complicated exhaust systems underneath the truck, with pipes running everywhere through diesel particle filters and various things. What we say to those, what you say in that situation is, when the truck pulls up from the road near the paddock, get out of the truck and walk around, take the tarps off, get a few things checked out and ready before you move into the paddock, and it cools the exhaust down enough to not cause any trouble. One of the things that I did notice in my observation of fires, starting from the header or starting from any ignition source in the paddock, but starting from the headers, for instance, I'll go through a thing that I picked up and noticed was that when you're on the header and your header does start a fire, it's generally 2 or 3 minutes before you actually see, and I'll base all this discussion on 35k winds, which is sometimes 35 FDI, sometimes under it, sometimes over it, but 35k winds. So it's 2 or 3 minutes later before you see in your rear vision mirrors a fire started from the header. It's probably about 10 or 15 metres square at that particular point. So you make the decisions, and sometimes it's better to have a bit of a think about the decisions you're going to make. But say you make the decisions to ring 000, or if you've got Freddie in the paddock over near the gate, or somebody coming down the road, or where's your firefighting unit. What I found was a private unit getting to a fire that's been started by a header is generally 10 or 12 minutes before it actually puts water on the flames. In 35k winds on a average 3 tonne to the hectare crop, which is leaving about 2 to 2.5 tonne of residue on the paddock, spread out beautifully, mind you. Out the back of the header, when you spread it out and chop it up, it's just the most beautiful stuff to burn. So your fires could be at a point of 350 or 400 metres long and 50, 60 or 80 metres wide before you actually put hard water on the fire. Then the next step is that you get the CFA comes along with their fire truck and your neighbours start coming along. Between between the fire starting and you reported it, before you get considerable forces on that fire at 35k winds, you're probably looking at an area 7 or 8 or 900 metres long and 150 metres wide. So before they put hard water, I'm not talking about people getting in the paddock, I'm talking about people getting their hoses unwrapped and their engines started. And there's a time gap there. So that's the sort of factor you're looking at. If you're stripping in 35k winds, this is what's going to happen on that day if you start a fire anyway, mechanically or whatever you do. It's going to be, you're going to have a 10 to 15 hectare fire in 30 minutes easy. So you can imagine the amount of resources you need around that fire just to put it out, even if it's not spreading. So that's something you need to plan around. You need to plan around the fact that you're sitting on a miniature time bomb that's capable of lighting fires, building its own material. Keep in mind, we go back to an old GL 200 inter header from 70 years ago. Just chuffed out a bit of stuff every 12-foot run when you went round the paddock. It would burn, but then it had trouble burning to the next row. What we're doing at the modern day headers with the choppers and the spreaders on the back is building the material that we're going to burn, the residue we're going to burn, we're joining it up to the next row perfectly even, and we're joining it up with beautiful fine stuff that burns well and spreads well. So that's a factor that we've had in the last few years where the fires have started and burnt a lot more, is the fact that we've got this material and we've got it out there, and we've got to understand the speed that that fire will spread at, and we've got to understand our capabilities to get there and do something with that fire. So you need to plan around a few things. You need to plan some comms. We're not asking you to alter your whole harvesting program. We just want you to dial in a management strategy around your whole farm with fire at harvest time. So we need you to think about, or we'd like you to think about how you would manage a fire and using those figures. And I'm not saying they're accurate, it all depends on the slope of the ground and all those things, but we're just talking about a rough medium. But that's what's going to happen on that 35k wind day. So you need to have some sort of comms plan where you're going to notify somebody. Have you got comms in the header? Can you get out to somebody with a phone, or can you not? What are you going to do if you can't? Can you, have you got people available? Not your 12-year-old daughter or your 80-year-old father. Have you got some people available there at the scene to handle the situation? Just have a bit of a think about. What I used to find when I was harvesting was that you'd get the comb and the header down to the paddock first thing, and you'd whop it all together and you'd start. Somebody would find the fuel trailer, somebody would find a truck, and you'd get all these things organised. Sometimes it was 24 hours later before we saw our water cart in the paddock. That's if people have had them. Back years ago, we didn't even have a water cart in the paddock, but we are bringing them up now. But what I found was that the priority in my mind was to keep the wheels turning on the header, and anything else was surplus to my needs as far as that was concerned. So you need to have this plan in your mind about how you're going to get water to the fire, how you're going to get personnel on these situations. Sometimes you might have to drop the chaser bin off and have somebody permanently sitting with the water on the trailer. If you've got a water tank in the back of the Land Cruiser and it's in town getting parts, that sort of makes the whole job a little bit hard. So I'm asking everybody to consider how they run their harvest plan. I'm not asking anybody or telling anybody how to run their business, but just think about how you can manage your fire risk without interfering with the production. And you can come up with a lot of little quick things you can do. I'm not a fan of having water tanks on tractors in front of chaser bins and things like that. If you've got something like that, you've got to keep in mind how you're going to get the water out of that tank and on the fire at that particular. If you've got a little fire, it's okay, but as soon as it starts to run, you're in a bit of trouble. You need a proper purposefully firefighting unit, either a trailer towed with a four-wheel drive or a four-wheel drive with a tank in the back. One of the things that's been coming onto the market is there's various items such as water in a pressurised tank under compressed air with nozzles around the header that have heat sensors on the nozzles, and when the heat gets to a certain point they open up. Other things is gel balls. You put them in various places around the engine bay and other parts of the header, and when the heat comes on they're supposed to do their job. One of the things we tried years ago was putting a fan on the header, putting deflector plates on the cowlings around the motor to deflect the air, to make a turbulence, and various things like that. In the final analysis, what I can say to you is that if you slow your header down so the ignition point is lower, you'll eliminate those fires concerning the exhaust gas temperature and the dust. I can guarantee that, but you have to work out exactly how much you've got to slow your header down. We're not about telling you how to run your farm. We understand that we've probably got the best farmers and the most intelligent and the most efficient farmers in the world working our cropping land in this time and age. So we're not about to tell you how to do it. All we want you to do is to have a little bit of a think about how you've been doing your job, and if there's something you can take away from this talk and say, this is what I can do to improve my situation and lessen the risks. As far as I know, the insurance companies have not reneged on paying out any headers, no matter what the conditions are, total fireban days or anything like that. But I want you to keep in mind that if you've got a contractor on your place, for instance, you're in charge of the contractor. It's your insurance policy as far as public risk goes, the fire escaping, burning to the next door neighbours and things like that. It's your insurance, not the contractor's. He's your employee. If you call him an employee or call him a contractor, you're still responsible. So if a fire gets off your property started by the contractor, it's your public risk that'll be the one that will pay the bills. So you're in charge of the contractor. You're allowed to say to the contractor, I don't want you to harvest today, it's too risky. I want you to do it this way. I want you to slow down. They're all decisions that you can make and tell the contractor. If the contractor's not happy to do that, well, it's your privilege to say, I'll go and find somebody else. So just be aware that you're the landowner and the paddock where the crop is your land and your decisions. There's been some volunteering between the VFF and the CFA and various other organisations about a 35 FDI figure. A 35 FDI figure can be arrived at with high temperature, no wind, high humidity and low wind and all sorts of things like that. The figure is variable. And the other problem with the FDI I found was that it was very hard to get an FDI figure near where you're working. And it's pretty hard to work the formula out standing in the paddock to get an FDI figure. The FDI figure you need to take notice of. It doesn't matter where you get your figures from. It might be 40 k's away from where you're working. is it's trending. If it's trending up, you know it's only going to get worse. If it's trending down, well, you know it's getting better. But you get an idea. You can use your 35k wind speeds. If you're harvesting in 50k winds, I think you're taking a too big a risk to be, and you shouldn't be out in the paddock. Forgetting about the FDI. If your wind speeds are over 35 k's, the risk factor increases multiple times each time it goes up a couple of k's. Under 35 k's, you've still got a risk factor, but hopefully you can manage it by having your fire units and various other things in your plan in action. If you've got to ring up the fire brigade and ask them whether you should be stripping, you've probably answered your own question. If you're sitting there wondering whether you should be harvesting and you've got to ring up the group officer, the captain or various people of your next door neighbour, you've actually answered your own question because you've got a doubt. You shouldn't be there doing it. If you feel uncomfortable about the risk that you're taking, pull out, keep out of the paddock, go home and have a cuppa. The question was about putting insulation, ceramics. A few people have experimented using marine coverings that they use on the boats to keep the heat from out in the boat, things like that. There is question marks about whether they retain the heat in around the turbo and have early turbo failures and things like that with doing ceramics, fiberglass or insulation material. I get back to my original point. We can stop these fires by just slowing the ground speed of the header down a little bit. We're not talking big amounts, we're talking little amounts. We're not talking cutting your speed from 10 k's down to 5 k's. We're talking from 10 k's down to 9 or 8.5 in certain patches. Just keep an eye on the dust coming in your header and just slow it down a fraction, and that'll pretty well eliminate the fires. I get back to my original statement. If you slow the header down a little bit, lower the exhaust gas temperature, you'll eliminate 80% of your fires straight away. If you walk around your header with the back of your hand, is what we used to do years ago, or with a technical thermometer and check the temperature of your bearings, you can generally get them before they blow up. You can just walk around your header and check to see what's going on. I have seen some very unusual things. There's things like the header front hitting a stone, sending a spark out. Chains for static electricity hitting a stone and starting a fire. I've seen a material getting in the hub of the main wheel with a rock or a piece of steel, and it's revolving round and round with that, and was able to make the heat enough with the dust that's in that wheel to start a fire. But we're talking about, if that's the only things that started fires, we wouldn't have to worry too much about header fires. Our biggest percentage of fires are started by the engine bay, and our second biggest percentage is started mechanically from bearings, pulleys and gearboxes and things like that. Pulleys, bearings are the highest percentage of the 20% that start fires. The question is, the 35 FDI is a figure that's been selected as don't harvest over 35 FDI and harvest under that point. The question is about the different things like pulses against various other crops that will light fires. One of the things I have found in this modern era of choppers and rotary headers and various things like that is that as I said, the arrangement of the residue in the paddock is perfect for a fire. Even if there's a little bit of moisture in the stalk and things like that, after it goes through the header, it will carry a fire far more readily than it did with the older type headers where they just push the chaff out the back in a row. So the risk factor is maybe less in wheat than it is in lentils, and that might be 9 years out of 10, but you've just got to be aware of your risk factor. It's the big thing you've got to work out in your mind is the risk factor that you're going to have at harvest time. You know that you've got an ignition point in the machinery, being it a tractor on a field bin or a truck, or you know you've got an ignition point, and you know most people are cutting their crops off at 6 inches or 8 inches, in that vicinity. The rest is all getting chopped up and spread out the back. So we know these factors are an even factor in the sense of the risk, and you've got to look at the moisture content and the wind speeds and things like that will increase the risk factor, but I don't think the risk factors a lot. The gap between pulses and cereals in the paddock, the risk factor of burning across the paddock within a couple of hours of the header going through is very similar in this day and age. Well, the likelihood of ignition between pulses and cereals on the lower averages, it's a lower ignition point for pulses than it is for cereals. But as I said, extenuating circumstances come in, like a heat wave just before the crop's about to ripen, desiccating barley to get rid of second growth or greenery out of the barley and things like that alters its ignition point. So you must be aware that if something interferes in the ripening stage, being it man or environment, it can lower the ignition point of the cereals to the point where it's very similar to the lentils. We keep in mind that as farming methods change, so does the risk factor in that fires coming out the back of the header. As long as you take away from this thinking about the risk factor of harvesting and how you can minimise it, we'd be as happy as Larry. So thank you very much for listening.